Our reflections continue with the words of our Master Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him. In the previous gathering, we reached the verse in which God says, "When you recite the Quran, seek refuge with Allah from Satan, the accursed." We concluded that seeking refuge cleanses the human soul, restoring it to its natural state of faith, free from Satan's whispers, which could otherwise hinder the soul's receptiveness to the guidance within the Quran. When any believer recites the Quran, they should imagine themselves hearing God speak, removing any intermediary speaker. This brings us to an observation from our revered Imam Jafar al-Sadiq, who once said, "I am amazed at those who fear yet do not take refuge in God's words. Sufficient for us is Allah, and He is the best disposer of affairs." The important point here is that he described hearing God's voice after this phrase, saying, "I heard God say," though he might have heard it from another reciter or was reading it himself. Notice his intense clarity in receiving the words of his Lord, as if hearing God himself speak. He then shared, "They returned with God's favor and bounty, unharmed by any misfortune." Thus, Imam Jafar offers a remedy for fear that may seize a person, to say, "Sufficient for us is Allah, and He is the best disposer of affairs," because everything that frightens you is insignificant compared to God's power. When you face any source of fear, recite this phrase, and take refuge in His power alone. Similarly, he expressed surprise at those who feel sorrow and do not turn to the words of God. "There is no God but you. Glory be to you. I was indeed among the wrongdoers." The noteworthy point here is, "I heard God say," and then, "So we responded to him and delivered him from distress, and thus do we deliver the believers." So a believer who recites this verse, like Prophet Yunus, will receive relief, not only for the Prophet, but also for all believers. Imam Jafar also marveled at those who are wronged and do not take refuge in the words, "I entrust my affair to God. Indeed, God is all-seeing of his servants." He continued, "I heard God say afterwards, so God protected him from the evil of what they plotted." And he wondered at those who seek worldly pleasures and do not turn to the words, "Whatever Allah wills, there is no power except with Allah," saying, "I heard God say afterwards, perhaps my Lord will give me something better than your garden." These four remedies address the various challenges of the human soul: fear, grief, deceit from others, and worldly desires, which could cloud one's spirit and peace. Thus, when the Quran instructs us to seek refuge with God from Satan, it is a preparation for the soul to receive God's words without the interference of Satan's whispers. When you seek refuge from Satan, you do so with the power of the creator of Satan himself. Satan can only approach you when you are alone, disconnected from your creator. But if you are in the company of God, Satan will never dare approach. This companionship with the divine imparts strength. For instance, when the Prophet, peace be upon him, was in the cave during the migration, and his companion Abu Bakr expressed concern, saying, "If one of them were to look down at his feet, they would see us," the Prophet reassured him. He said, "What do you think of two, the third of whom is Allah, as referenced in the verse, 'Do not grieve, indeed Allah is with us.'" Abu Bakr was reassured by the Prophet, who affirmed that in God's company, even if someone looked directly at them, they would not be seen. How so? Because they were under God's protection, and if human eyes cannot perceive God, how could they perceive his protected ones? In a similar way, if one seeks refuge in God from Satan, they are under God's protection, and Satan cannot challenge God. Satan's battle is not with God, but with God's creation. Thus, whoever allows themselves to be distanced from God makes themselves vulnerable to Satan. Whoever maintains a connection to God remains untouchable by Satan. When the believer is in God's company, Satan has no access, for the believer is occupied with the clarity of hearing God. This is the essence of when you recite the Quran, seek refuge with Allah from Satan, the accursed. Prepare your soul for entrance into God's presence, and then you say, "In the name of Allah, the most compassionate, the most merciful." Why? Because just as the Quran began with, "Recite in the name of your Lord," it should be recited with that invocation in mind. When God commanded the Prophet to recite, it could have implied reading something memorized or written. But the Prophet was neither literate nor had anything memorized. When he responded, "I am not a reciter," it was an honest acknowledgement of his state, with God affirming his power. This interaction refutes any claim that the Quran was merely Muhammad's inner thoughts. The command, recite, and his reply, I am not a reciter, highlight two distinct personalities, one commanding, one admitting his inability. The Prophet's refusal underlined two distinct personalities, one who commands with authority and one who acknowledges his reality. Had it been a single person's monologue, there would be no dialogue. Instead, we have two distinct, harmonious personas, each consistent with their role. The command to recite came with authority, and the response, I am not a reciter, with understanding of one's human limitations. Thus, the Quran begins with, recite in the name of your Lord, not in your own knowledge. And so, as the Quran was first revealed in the name of the Creator, we recite it today by saying, in the name of Allah. The phrase, in the name of Allah, can be understood from two angles. If a person tries to persuade you of something, you might ask, on whose authority are you speaking? When they respond, in the name of such and such authority, they are referring to their power or role, which gives them legitimacy. Similarly, when we embark on any task, we do so in recognition of our limitations. For instance, when we plant crops, we neither created the soil nor the seeds, nor do we bring the rain. We simply utilize God's creation. Thus, we start our endeavors by acknowledging that we do not do so by our own power, but by God's will. When you approach any task within the name of Allah, it is as if you are saying, I come to you by the command of Allah, who has subjected this task to me, ensuring it does not defy his will. The sun, moon, air, clouds, all these exist by God's decree. When we begin within the name of Allah, we recognize his command over all things. So as you embark on any task, remember that by saying in the name of Allah, you acknowledge that you rely on his will and his subjugation of creation for you. This acknowledgement transforms our mundane actions, grounding them in divine purpose and ensuring that all we do is in line with God's supreme will. When you approach any task, first consider the forces at play that are beyond your control. Often, you'll find you have no inherent power over the outcome. So if you're unable to exert influence, how do you proceed? The answer is by relying on the one who made it possible. The act is made viable not through your power, but through the will of the Creator who has enabled it for you. This is the first point. Another point to consider is that when people act, they may focus solely on the material outcome, much like non-believers who only consider the immediate benefits, like food, drink, and physical comfort. The believer, however, approaches their work with a different mindset. They work because God has either permitted or commanded it. This brings both material benefits and spiritual reward. The believer performs each action with God in mind, thereby deriving both tangible results and an eternal reward that transcends the task's immediate time frame. When we say, in the name of God, before any action, it implies we are approaching it not through our own strength, but because God has enabled it for us. Without his enabling, it wouldn't respond to us or yield any outcome. For example, think of animals. Some are domesticated and others are not, despite our efforts. We can tame a camel or an elephant, but we can't domesticate a small snake or a fly. Why? It's not a matter of strength. Rather, God has left certain creatures beyond human control to show that if he doesn't enable us, we cannot tame them. The Creator's power is what makes some animals respond to us, not our skill or effort. So, when you start a task with, in the name of God, you acknowledge that success is not due to your power, but to God, who has made the situation accessible to you. Even non-believers benefit from God's will, but the believer recognizes this and keeps God in mind during the act, earning both the material benefit and a spiritual reward. God has established laws in the universe, but may sometimes override them to remind us of his supreme will. For example, areas with constant rainfall may occasionally suffer drought, reminding us that nature's processes are not absolute. They operate according to God's will. Rain, growth, and sustenance are ultimately governed by divine discretion. This breaks the assumption that natural laws are self-sustaining without God's intervention. Similarly, when it comes to creation, we understood that human beings reproduce through a male and a female. However, God may create exceptions, as in the miraculous conception of the prophet Jesus, which demonstrates that creation is subject to his will alone. Such miracles remind believers that God's power supersedes natural laws. God can bend or break these laws to illustrate that he is not bound by them. Consider the example of Mary, who was provided sustenance directly from God. When questioned by Zechariah, she replied, "It is from God. He provides sustenance without measure." This prompted Zechariah to pray for a child despite his and his wife's old age. God granted his prayer, defying natural limitations, thus affirming his power to provide beyond human understanding. In the grander scheme, these exceptions to natural laws serve as signs of God's sovereignty. By occasionally suspending natural laws, God underscores that everything in creation ultimately submits to his will, and nothing happens outside his control. This should lead believers to recognize and submit to God's authority in all things, and to always remember that every action we take is ultimately by God's allowance and grace. It is inappropriate for people to speculate blindly, each offering a different opinion, as this detracts from the intended meaning. The prophet was instructed not to inquire about certain details from them because aspects like the number of individuals involved, their names, their location, or the time period are not crucial to the essence of the story. This is because if names or specific details were given, people might think that the story is unique to those individuals, a one-time occurrence. By keeping these details indefinite, no names, numbers, specific time, or place, God intended the example to serve as a timeless lesson applicable to any group of people under any names in any era and any location. If the story had been personalized with specific details, it could be interpreted as applicable only to that exact time and place. The absence of these specifics allows it to become a universal example, showing that any virtuous individuals could similarly exemplify the values portrayed, regardless of who they are or where they come from. When God chooses to name a character, like Mary, he identifies her specifically with her father's name, Mary, daughter of Imran, indicating her unique and unparalleled position in history. For other examples, such as the wife of Noah or the wife of Lot, they are mentioned without specific names because the focus is on the lesson in their actions rather than their identity. Similarly, in the case of Pharaoh's wife, her character is illustrated without a name to convey her independent faith, separate from Pharaoh's. This approach prevents us from restricting the moral to a specific individual or time. So when someone asks, "Who was the man of the two horns, Dul Qarnayn?" they may miss the point because if the Quran had specified his identity, it would imply that the moral lesson only applies to him. Instead, by keeping his identity open, it signifies that this lesson applies to anyone of similar character and strength who receives God's favor and acts righteously. The concept of saying, "In the name of God the most merciful, the most compassionate," at the start of any task signifies dedicating the work to God, avoiding pride or ego. Without this dedication, a person might mistakenly believe their success is solely due to their own efforts. By saying, "In the name of God," one attributes their abilities and successes to God, thereby safeguarding the intention and maintaining the reward in the hereafter. Starting with "in the name of God" reminds us to avoid actions displeasing to God, as one would hesitate to invoke God's name for something sinful. The names most merciful and most compassionate are particularly meaningful, as they indicate God's unchanging mercy and compassion toward creation. God's mercy is like a mother's womb, nurturing and protecting, emphasizing an everlasting quality. The idea of God being most merciful and most compassionate is rooted in compassion, signifying boundless patience and understanding. This idea is drawn from a divine attribute of love and kindness, and thus saying "in the name of God" carries a protective grace, ensuring that the action is undertaken with a humble heart and a pure intention. Importantly, God's mercy and compassion don't waver between extremes. Unlike human qualities, which may change or intensify, God's attributes are consistent. For instance, his mercy covers both the believer and the non-believer in this world, and his compassion is limitless. But his specific compassion for believers may manifest fully in the hereafter. Therefore, God does not change due to our actions, yet he allows us to change and grow closer to him. This consistency and divine patience are essential to the relationship between God and humanity. God's unwavering nature invites us to better ourselves for his sake. Thus, When someone transgresses but continues to call upon God, they are not shunned. God's essence of being forbearing and covering means that he continues to show patience and grants forgiveness. Therefore, one should never hesitate to begin a task with, "In the name of God," trusting in his mercy, even if they have erred in the past. This is a powerful testament to God's boundless compassion, which invites us to return to him, knowing he remains unchanged by our actions and ever forgiving. When God says, "And your Lord is not unjust to his servants," people who engage in philosophical discussions might interpret this as a statement of exaggeration. They ask, if he's not unjust, does that mean he has some level of injustice in him? But when we negate something about someone using an exaggerated form, it doesn't deny the original characteristic. For example, if you say so-and-so is not a heavy eater, does that negate that they eat? No, it only denies the exaggeration. He's not a heavy eater, but he still eats. Similarly, your Lord is not unjust doesn't imply any injustice. The phrase is in a superlative form, meaning God doesn't commit even the smallest form of injustice. However, we might think it suggests some lesser form of injustice, but that's a misconception. Attributes related to God are absolute and don't fluctuate in degrees. His justice is complete and unchanging. When we say, "And your Lord is not unjust servants," it means he doesn't commit repeated or recurring injustice against anyone. Were God to wield his power unjustly against people continuously, he'd be an oppressor. But his nature prohibits even that notion. Injustice typically correlates with one's capability. One can only oppress those they have power over. But God, if he allowed himself such a thing, wouldn't just be unjust. He'd be utterly unjust, given his infinite power. Yet his essence negates all forms of injustice because his perfection has no bounds. Thus, the attributes of God don't change or fluctuate in magnitude. His perfection is constant. The variety we see in his actions is due to the differences in creation, not in his nature. When we read the Quran, we begin with, "In the name of Allah, the most merciful, the most compassionate." This is meant to guide us in every action, reminding us of God's facilitation in all things. Without his will, nothing could be achievable for us, not even a simple task. So by starting with God's name, all that a believer does gains meaning and rewards. If a believer even approaches an action with sincere intent, like enjoying time with their spouse for the sake of maintaining a good family or desiring righteous offspring, it becomes rewarding. As narrated, the prophet was once asked, "Is there reward even in satisfying our desires?" He replied, "If it were done in an unlawful way, there would be punishment. So if it's lawful, why wouldn't there be reward?" Every deliberate act that we engage in is supposed to begin with God's name. Any action that takes conscious effort, known as a thoughtful act, should be approached in the name of God. Conversely, actions we do impulsively or without prior thought don't require this invocation, and they are forgiven by God. A person's actions have 3 stages: mental intent, the thought of doing something; verbal expression, saying, "I want a cup of water," and the final action itself, receiving and drinking the water. In commands, the verbal expression and mental intention lead to the action, but in statements, the mental and verbal stages don't affect the external reality. Thus, any action requiring thoughtful intention should begin with Bismillah, in the name of God. Without this, the action remains incomplete. Even if a non-believer performs the same act, they won't achieve the spiritual reward, only the physical outcome. The believer, however, achieves both. In this, God teaches us to start every act, including reading the Quran, with, "In the name of Allah, the most merciful, the most compassionate." This ensures that our actions are meaningful and not empty. May God guide us in all our actions, and until we meet again, God willing.